Give it up for Gavin and Margaret, our guests today. Gavin is the founder and general partner of Kickstart, the OG of venture capital in the state of Utah. So we're so honored to have Gavin, who thinks about this issue, AI, probably from a different perspective than a lot of folks, right? Like from the perspective of the entrepreneurs and startups and those who are building these companies, kind of the next wave of things. And we have Margaret, who is the executive director of the Chamber, no, why did I say that? Department of Commerce. I always get Commerce and Chamber. The executive director of the Department of Commerce, who is the entity in charge of regulating AI in the state of Utah. So again, give it up for these guys. We're going to have a great conversation.
Thank you.
Are we on? Yeah.
I think we're on, yeah.
Okay, Margaret, let's start with you. Give us a sense for how the state is thinking about regulating AI right now.
Yeah, so I think that Utah has really come up with a very innovative approach to AI. So let me give you a little bit of history. So about almost 3 years ago, myself and a couple of leaders in the legislature, Jeff Moss, who at the time was majority leader, he's now over at the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity, and Senator Kurt Collimore, who is the majority leader in the Senate, came together with a few other experts on this issue of AI. Because if you all recall, November 22nd of 2022 was when the whole world just kind of changed in an instant when ChatGPT, the first public-facing ChatGPT product, was introduced. And there was just an incredible amount of excitement and an incredible amount of anxiety, both of those things at the same time as people were sort of trying to contemplate the future. And we wanted to do something in Utah. There was a lot of sort of hand-wringing. What should we do? The cat's already out of the bag. Is there anything to be done? We came up with sort of 3 principles that we wanted to adhere to in our policy approach. One was to encourage innovation, and particularly with small tech. We were just talking about this a little bit, with small tech. 2 was to protect the public. We could see there were real potential harms. And 3, maybe most interestingly, we wanted to make sure that we had a function within government that was keeping its eyes on the technology, which is what we did not have happening with social media. We just didn't understand it, and we went for a long time it not being addressed because there was simply a lack of understanding of the effects and how the technology worked. So those were the 3 principles that we went into trying to craft the policy approach. And what came out of that was the creation of the Office of AI Policy. Courtney Ray works for our Office of AI Policy. There she is. She's head of stakeholder outreach there. And we stood it up. It was passed in legislation in 2024. We stood that up in about a year and a half ago, almost, within our department. And it was that the idea came from a lot of stakeholder outreach. We did a ton of focus groups, talking with AI executives, tech executives here in Utah, talking with experts in order to kind of get this right and to craft a balanced approach. What the Office of AI Policy does is really 2 things. One is to offer regulatory relief or some form of regulatory mitigation to AI companies. We know that there are a lot of existing regulations that were crafted at a time when the idea of generative AI was not even contemplated. It just never would have been contemplated, and so those regulations just aren't necessarily, they may not be relevant. So we wanted to be able to enable companies to come to this office and say, hey, this regulation is getting in the way. And then the office has the ability to go to the relevant regulators, most of whom are in our department, but sometimes they lay outside of our department, and get temporary relief. So we have authority from the legislature to give temporary regulatory relief And that way, to companies, and that way we can also learn how we might regulate better, how we may need to eliminate regulations, all of those things. The second function of the office is to run what we call a learning lab, which is to proactively, in this function of sort of observing and learning what's going on, proactively take up issues where we may need to introduce regulation, or we may need to clear out regulation or change up regulation based on this new technology, do a deep dive with stakeholders, with experts, and make recommendations to the legislature. So that's really the approach that Utah has taken, this kind of balanced approach that we can help encourage innovation, particularly those small tech companies that don't have armies of lawyers, to be able to come in and do that in our state, and then also still keep an eye on how we can protect the public for harms that are happening. So that's kind of our approach.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to come back to you on the protect the public part, just to double click on that for a second. Gavin, Governor Cox probably 3-4 weeks ago kind of retweeted, reposted, re-X'd, whatever you say now, Governor DeSantis, who is calling for state-by-state regulation of AI. So what Governor DeSantis wants is like each state to be able to regulate AI however they'd like, right? And it seems that Governor Cox agrees with that approach. And by the way, rightfully so, Governor Cox points to social media as an example of something that probably, had this happened, we wouldn't have had as many harms in specific states who, maybe could regulate it a little bit. So it's not like there's nothing to the argument that states should do this state by state, right? The tech community at large is probably more in line with like the czar of AI, David Sachs, President Trump's AI czar. I don't know if anybody saw his post recently about how there should just be one, with states having certain carve-outs and things like that. I just wonder, Gavin, like, how do you think about this? Should we have 50 rule books or one?
Yeah, so maybe helpful to give me a little context on kind of where I'm coming from with this, and just kind of how what I'd characterize broadly as little tech would see this, and specifically tech in Utah. So I think it's important you go back in our history, and we've battled really hard in Utah, Silicon Slopes, to be relevant, to have successful companies, to have a vibrant community here of job creating startups that actually are going out and they're making a dent in the world, which we're so proud of. We win awards every year in Utah for the success of our companies, the success per capita, like this. In some ways, we have to have this. We have so many kids and so many. We need to create these jobs in order to have them, right? We don't have a choice. Like I always say that with Utah, we're like, it's an amazing mix. We have the demographics of like a developing country and the education of a first, and we have to grow. And even with that, we have these challenges of housing and all these things that we're trying to deal with, air. But we'd rather have the problems of growth than lack of growth. So I'd say we've worked hard to get here, and we've had to battle so hard the power and the influence of let's say California and the coast, because they really dominate tech, right? And rightfully so. Now you go back in our history, we had some of those early companies. We all know this story, and they why did they leave? It wasn't capital. That was a big part of my story about why I started Kickstart, and so this has been my career. It's like fighting this battle. Okay. We've had big disruptions in technology that I've seen in my career. I've been doing this about 20 years, and mobile, cloud, these really change things, and they reset the winners and losers. AI is likely the biggest of all those, and one of my concerns as someone who funds little tech companies and knows how hard it is for them to be successful, and Utah has such a special environment for supporting this innovation. We don't demonize the companies that are successful. We celebrate them. That's amazing. Other places don't do that, which I think makes Utah special. But I worry that there's a re-centralization that's happening with the rise of AI, and where it was broadening, like the tech industry was really broadening out, and places like Utah were becoming more and more relevant. we risk that going backwards right now. So I will say, as it relates to the AI framework, I'm really motivated to make sure, certainly, that we protect our kids, that we have a better outcome than we'd have with social media, and I think there's a lot of components to that. I'm also really motivated for our kids that Utah and the other states that we invest in, like Colorado, continue to really support a landscape that allows little tech to compete with big tech. Ultimately, like I think government has I'm an econ guy, so I think government plays an important role. Generally, I think government gets in the way a lot and creates a lot of problems. And so I think the best thing for consumers as it relates to AI is lots of choice, lots of options, and startups competing with these incumbents. We're talking about multi-trillion-dollar companies now. They have armies of lobbyists. Just to give you a sense. So, and I recently, and this was said in the press release, I took over as the chair of the National Venture Capital Association, which is kind of crazy because no one from Utah has ever really been on that board even. And it shows that Utah is becoming more relevant. That said, and we're there trying to represent our industry. Any one of the big tech companies probably has like 10 times the budget that the entire Venture Capital Association has. And so we're trying to focus on, okay, how do we have startups level the playing field? Anyway, so that I give it all as background and say, I don't know exactly what I would say on what we should do in Utah. I think we're doing pretty well, like as far as I can tell. I think we're having a nice, thoughtful balance between innovation and how do we protect. What's worrisome is stuff like Colorado. Okay, where Colorado, and this is what's going to happen if we have a patchwork, right? It's going to be the most annoying state, the state that's most anti-business, and we kind of know which state that's going to be. That's going to drive all of it. Yeah. And we're going to end up in a place where unless you have lawyers, unless you have huge fixed cost base to kind of handle the morass, it's like what happens in Europe, right? And it's just like, let's try to. So for me, and we'll jump to solutions. But so for me, that's what I'm worried about. For my industry, for our kids, is this like, I want consumers to have choice. I want America to win. That's a big concern of mine. This generation's. I'm not going to say Cold War, but this is an important great power conflict between the U.S. and China that we do need to win. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be small companies that really make that happen.
Margaret, what do you think about that? Like, there is some truth to this idea of like, hey, if California has the most restrictive AI regulations for startups and things like that, it really kind of is California who is setting the AI policy for the entire country. Because it kind of doesn't matter what Utah does. If Utah's less restrictive, but you still need to sell into California, you're just going to base everything on whatever the most restrictive state is, right? How do you think about what Gavin just said? And just that general idea of like the most restrictive state is actually the one that will set the policy for the entire country because you got to sell into all the states, sorry.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting conversations that are happening about this. There's some really interesting arguments here. I think the key is to recognize that not all regulation is the same. And there are different kinds of regulation, some of which really should be, I think, at the state level, and some that I think the federal level should cover. And the way that we have, as sort of policymakers, thought about this, and the governor is thinking about this, is that it really should be the federal government that is regulating the development of AI.
Yeah.
So the development of these foundational models, how, what's going into them, the idea that they're sort of not understandable to us, is that a problem or not? That should all be at the federal level. I'm going to come back to that in a minute because there's obviously a problem there. When it comes to how technologies are deployed, how AI is deployed, that is where the state should have freedom to regulate because that's how it's affecting our citizens. So that's kind of how we have thought about it in our framework and the issues that we're taking up in the Office of AI Policy and as we work with the legislature. is we want to focus on places where we see problematic deployment. So where are we seeing problematic deployment? So that the issue that we took up first and was passed into legislation in the last legislative session early in the early months of this year was on mental health therapy bots. Okay, so there was a lot of stuff coming out about these bots that were problematic. They were recommending suicide, these kinds of things. And we said, we have an interest, the state has an interest in the mental health of our kids.
100%. And
so what the law actually did, which I actually think was a really cool balanced approach, is first of all, it said, obviously the business models right now of these bots is to collect as much information and data about us as possible, and they then be able to share and sell that data. Now, we can talk about that business model later. I think that's super problematic, particularly when it comes to a mental health therapy bot, because now the data you're putting into that bot is far richer than what you ever put on social media. I mean, this is the most personal information about yourself. And so we simply said in the law, you can't share or sell the data. You can't serve up targeted ads. But we also said something interesting, which is right now, if you want to practice mental health therapy in the state of Utah, you have to be a person with a license. And our agency actually regulates that. So you have to go get a license from our Division of Professional Licensing if you're going to do that. So that actually means you can't actually even deploy a mental health therapy bot legally because we don't have a framework for that. So what we said in the law is, if we're going to go ahead and say you all can deploy mental health therapy bots, even if you're not a person that has a license, we won't go after you if you're doing these 10 things that we did a ton of research on about putting, just sort of, if you're deploying in such a way with these different methodologies and you're doing all the red teaming necessary and this kind of stuff, then here's a pathway to innovation. You can actually deploy a mental health therapy bot in the state of Utah if you're doing those things, and we won't go after you for unlicensed practice. But you can't share or sell the data, you can't serve up targeted ads. So that was an example of how we created this kind of pathway to innovation, but also did some protection. So mental health therapy bots, the things that we're working on right now that you'll see in the legislative session come January are AI companions, okay? We've seen a lot of harm come from those. So what's the right approach? AI companions. So there's specific companies that like Character AI or Replica AI that are specifically designed to create a companion. But then there's also the generalized chat bots.
Really like AI girlfriend, boyfriend kind of stuff.
Correct, correct. Yeah. And that's where you see a lot of usage and a lot of harm.
Pretty
and so
sketchy,
we're looking at that, and we're looking at deep fakes.
Yeah.
And sort of how to deal with that. And so that's where I think the states should have a say. And they've always had a say in protecting their citizens. That is part of federalism. Generally, if you read the US Constitution, most of the lawmaking rights reside with the states. And there's only a few exceptions at the federal level. Now, the biggest problem with the federal level right now, again, I believe that they should be doing the regulation of the development of AI, is that we don't have a Congress that functions right now. They're simply not doing it. They have not done anything on tech policy. They haven't been able to get anything done on social media. They haven't been able to get anything done on data ownership or data privacy, nothing. And that's also why the states have been stepping in this giant vacuum.
Yeah, totally. I think, and I think in some ways my concerns, as a practitioner, as a funder of many startups, is probably way less about Utah. I have a lot of confidence. We have great elected officials and we have great teams around those elected officials, in my view. And we have a very common sense approach to this. I think that we're trying to balance, we're trying to win as a state. We care about team. And so in some ways I have, I'm always going to be interested in, but it's more the national conversation creeping into Utah that I think is the threat here. And how does Utah try to lead, try to be the coalition that leads to the rational outcome here that helps the U.S., that helps Utah. I feel like that may be our role here, is to try to lead, in some ways, nudge, cajole, just to try to be common sense about this. Because there's a lot of landmines here in terms of in terms of harm. There's a lot of landmines in terms of the U.S. losing its place in the world. All those things are, real right now that we need to figure out.
Can I say something to that? Because I want to say how important that is. Utah really is playing a leading role here, and it's very much reflective of our overall culture. Like, I think we have an incredible tech sector, and you've done such a great job in building this up and building a community around it, and it really is incredible. And I know the governor feels very much, very passionate about wanting to build up our tech sector. And we also are a family-friendly state. We also really want to protect our kids. We also want to protect our individual agency, right? And that's where I think there's some issues of like, are we going to be exploited and manipulated because of all the data that's being collected on us can now be used potentially against us. So there's a lot of concerns there. So there's like all these values together really give Utah the ability to lead out. And I think it's what informed our regulatory approach, our Office of AI Policy, which we've gotten, so much sort of recognition and people wanting to do something similar to kind of have that balanced approach. And then, was anyone here at the Utah AI Summit? So a bunch of you were there. And that's something that we organized along with our partners, the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity. There, Governor Cox announced a new initiative called Utah's Pro-Human AI Initiative. And this is exactly what you're saying, Gavin. This is really about how does Utah lead out on how to set the example of how we can do AI well. Right. And he talked about 6 pillars that we're going to be focusing on. So it's workforce development, a lot of anxiety about that. Is my job going to be automated? How do we give people the confidence that we're going to go about this in a way that is going to be empowering to people?
Right.
Education, how do we make sure that it's being deployed in the schools in a way that is helpful and not sort of deletion of learning, right? How do we do it in the right way? How do we do it how do we galvanize our academic researchers to really think about a moonshot that is like amazing for humanity using AI? So that's the 3rd pillar. 4th pillar is state deployment of AI. How do we do this for our citizens and their interactions with state government? 5th pillar is regulatory policy, which we already talked about. And finally, in our industry, how do we create cultural norms that our companies here are doing things that are pro-human? They're not serving up sexualized chat bots to kids, which frankly is what Meta is doing right now. And so that's what we want to promote here. And that's where I think Utah can truly be a leader.
Yeah.
You said something really interesting, Margaret, around the idea. It's like Washington, D.C. is so dysfunctional that this idea of like they'll figure this out, period, is weird. So the states kind of do need to step up and take a leadership role regardless. And also, when you said that, I was thinking like there's only 6 companies that are building like the foundational models. Maybe I'm missing 1 or 2. But really, like it's like trying to start an oil company. You got to have billions and billions and billions of dollars at this point in order to start an AI company. And the regulatory capture of that is far more likely at the federal level than the state level. Don't you think, Kevin?
I think that's fair. And let's say it's 20 max. And would love for Utah to be in the mix. We're not now in that.
We don't have any of those.
And we're in the mix for. And when this first came out, for me as an investor in small startups outside the coast, primarily, I was worried of like, okay, what role are startups going to play? We're going to have kind of one model to rule them all, And I think it's increasingly obvious now that, okay, this is a new layer of software, but there's going to be lots of places for startups to play. Thankfully for Utah, but yes, I think we need to really watch the regulatory capture aspect of the large. We've never seen companies as big as the hyperscalers are now. We've never seen companies like this in the history of the U.S. Well, maybe on a GDP adjusted basis, maybe Standard Oil or whatever. But these are powerful companies that are growing fast, and they're great businesses. But they're behaving in questionable ways in some cases. We need to watch them. And
by the way, it's the same companies for the most part, with the exception of OpenAI, which is who knows? Like, it seems like Google's actually winning, but it's the same companies that you just met, and Meta and, you know, Grok and all that, you know, kind of screwed us in the social media stuff.
Yeah.
That part's
Yeah.
pretty,
And so,
can't be.
so for me, like, what's, you know, how do we combat that?
Yeah.
Like, certainly we need to protect folks. We need to, there's a regulatory aspect. There's also just a choice aspect. Consumers need choice. And so we need to make sure that other choices come along that market themselves saying, hey, this is safe for kids. This is, you know, I mean, here's the reasons why. And like, you know, a great example locally is Angel Studios. Right? We were the first investor, Angel Studios. And they had to fight so much, that industry, right? Like lawsuits. Oh, for the time that we first invested in them, they were in a lawsuit, you know, and they lost every lawsuit, but they created an amazing company. And because they realized consumers want a choice. Consumers want to be able to take their kids to a film in the you know, and watch a movie and not be embarrassed and not feel you know, awkward about what the content, or be excited about the content, and they get that choice with Angel Studios and others. And so that's a big part of this, is how do we change this? More choice, and we need more competition and not less. And so that's for me, that's a big framework of like, how do we get more competition going and more transparency on the realities of what's on offer from, you know, existing competitors.
I think I understand this, but I want to ask both of you. And Gavin, you mentioned this a little bit before. Like, we're kind of in like our Cold War struggle.
Yeah.
The United States needs to beat China here in this AI race. Why? What does that mean?
Yeah. You know, I'm definitely not an expert on this, but what I would say is, you know, and I think China is a rational competitor, right? But they're, you know, you look around the world, right? And, you know, China and other places, and it's like, what does the U.S. have that other, you know, we have this incredible, we're blessed with incredible natural resources. We're essentially a huge island, you know, in North America, that we're protected from a lot of, we're insulated from a lot of things that other folks experience. But we don't work harder than people anymore, right? We're not smarter than, you know, necessarily other people. Maybe we're more educated in some cases, maybe not. We innovate. That's what we have, honestly. That's the engine. Like, big companies are a net negative on job growth. All the job growth comes from small companies. And the engine behind that is entrepreneurs, whether funded by venture capital or not. And many of those don't come from the U.S., honestly. You know, many are from the U.S., but many are not. And so we need to keep that alive. And that's the key to winning in tech. And it's the key to winning in the economy and even in defense. Like, you're seeing how this ethic of like, let's rethink how we do defense. Let's have innovative small companies come in and compete with these defense contractors who are charging too much, exploiting the government, and frankly not innovating. And so you're seeing that ethic, and I do love how this administration is encouraging that. I think that's really positive. Don't agree with everything they're doing, certainly, but that's one thing I'm seeing is like, hey, I love to see the innovation coming into defense and other categories. But as it relates to China, power is kind of what, you know, on the global stage, economic power, defense power, that's what speaks. And AI is on a collision path where it will quickly, you know, be one of the most important aspects of power in the world, including nuclear weapons.
Well,
and so,
if
you,
literal power, like
literal power, right, where it's kind of like AI power will translate directly into, you know, defense power, into financial power, economic power, and so that's where. And there's a lot of areas with China where, you know, they just have huge advantages over us related to power, you know, and Utah is very forward on this, which is awesome. We're building, you know, lots of power capacity, but China just has the ability to put up a nuclear power plant every month, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of areas where it's going to be tough to compete, but what we have is innovation. And so that's why I say it's like, hey, if we want our way of life to continue as it is for our kids, we need to compete and we need to win. You know, we don't have to crush China. We can trade with China. You know, let's you know, I think this can be actually very rational. But the power is what keeps it rational, if that makes sense.
I guess the underlying thought behind that question is like, why is it so important to beat China in the AI race? What does winning the AI race even mean? I don't know that I know the answer to either of those things, but I think the underlying thought behind those two questions are, why don't we just stop this for a second, get our bearings, like Elon Musk was calling for 24 months ago, and understand like the damages that could happen to society from this, the pros that could happen to, like, why can't we just, like, why don't we just blow up the data centers for a second? Like, I don't know. Like, obviously we're not going to for all the reasons that we all know, but like, why don't we? Like, what does this mean? Like, what does it mean to like win the AI race? I would love for someone to explain that to me.
It's actually a great question, and I don't have a really awesome answer to it. But what I can tell you is winning the AI race with China is not winning it at the cost of, making, not allowing regulation on sexualized chatbots for our kids. Right? Yeah. So that's not what it looks like. And so that's why the argument that sort of we can't regulate at all or we're going to lose the race to China, which again, it's undefined what that means, that argument is just nonsensical because there are certain kinds of regulation that will in fact impede our ability to win the race or get ahead or whatever. Yeah. But there's other kinds of regulation that I think actually will help us. It will give more clear guardrails. It'll help our population to come up to speed better by allowing us to understand better what's going on, so the asymmetry between what we as sort of consumers understand and the people building the models is a little bit reduced, because right now it's rising exponentially. Being able to essentially have a society where we're not feeling like we're just being exploited and manipulated because these giant 5 companies have all the data about all of us, because that truly is a surveillance society, and that's what China wants. So I don't think doing it that way is going to help us win the war against China, or we're going to become people that we don't even recognize today. So I think winning it, really, the methodology to getting there is thinking about the right kinds of guardrails that make sense. Yeah. And that's really the key. And so the idea that's sort of been put forth that we can't have any regulation or we're going to lose the race, I think is it's a false dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy.
Yeah,
exactly.
I totally agree.
And here's the other thing too. You're thinking about like blowing up data centers. So I really think that I saw a survey recently which I thought was really interesting. And I said this at the AI Summit for those of you that were there. But a recent survey says that now more than half of Americans are more fearful about AI than they are excited. So both of those emotions have been rising. They're both of them are at fever pitch, and excitement and fear and anxiety. And I think what's driving it is that people are looking around. They're seeing stories about kids that are committing suicide because of their conversations with ChatGPT. They're seeing, oh my goodness, companies are firing all these people. I may lose my job. They're seeing electricity prices going up and data centers being built in their backyard, and they're not seeing cancer cured. Yeah. And so they're looking around and saying, why? I don't like this thing. And that is the biggest risk I think we have in not being able to win the war against China, is that we need to create opportunities and trust in this technology so that we can feel good about it as a nation. And that's the biggest thing. Or otherwise, you are going to have crazy people out there blowing up data centers. Like, I literally think that could happen, And so that's, to me, why we have to be very rational and think through clearly how we want to do this. That's what's behind the Utah's Pro-Human AI initiative, is to build that trust and have people be able to see that this is going to be a good thing, and we have to make it happen. We have to make it be a good thing.
Yeah,
for us.
I think that's great.
Let me stop talking.
Yeah, no, I think those are all great points. And I would say just on that, how do we, so much of why that's the case, right, is I think, the reality is there are some negative data points about what's going on with AI for sure, but clearly our media is obsessed with, and it's probably just also like our history of storytelling around this, right, is all doomsday. It just is. And so we're kind of in love with this narrative of like, being enslaved by the robots and all this. And in the reality, in these, we have 150 companies, let's say half of them are doing something in AI now. And the reality is it's still software. It's actually, there's no magic. It's like, it's hard. It doesn't work great all the time. But I think it's incumbent on the entrepreneurs and those that are building these kind of companies that are, and most of it's very blue collar, like, hey, let's help radiologists be 20% better. Let's help, people who are nursing be a little more efficient. Like it's these kind of smaller gains. And it's incumbent on entrepreneurs to lift their heads up and tell the stories of how they're benefiting society, and people who are using these tools, which is a lot of us these days, say, wow, this is really helping me do this better. And there's been a lot of fear mongering. I think we're going to get to a point where there'll be, you think about like what happened with like the .com crash, where it was, it felt like, oh, okay, that never happened. And then, 5-10 years later, we're like, oh, that was bigger than we ever thought. I think AI is going to be the same thing, but bigger, in the sense that like there'll be some disillusionment, like, oh, that didn't happen. We spent all this money on data centers. We didn't see the gains. But I think a lot of it is like telling the positive stories. Positive news just doesn't sell like negative news. And, both extremes kind of hate tech right now, of the aisle. And there's reasons for both too, for sure. Many are justified, but I think a lot of us, it's incumbent on like, if you're in a position to influence it, it's like, hey, let's implement, AI in our businesses and how we live in a way that makes sense and that is reasonable and ethical, and see the gains. And then it's preparing this generation to be part of the workforce that will be changed and different, but great in so many ways, better. The metaphor I've been using is it's kind of like, my kids are both in college right now, and they're, getting used to using AI and how they work. And, for them, being out in the workforce, not using an AI tool is going to feel like, oh, well, I object to the computer, I just choose not to use, it's like, you're like, that's absurd. And it's going to feel the same way. Hopefully we're talking about an era where we're talking about humans having superpowers versus being replaced. But there will be some disruption.
I think, the disruption I think is real. I think
Yeah.
the point that you mentioned there about making everything more efficient is absolutely true. Like it's making everybody more efficient.
Yeah.
Like even like Silicon Slopes, like at our height, we probably had 20 employees, right? We can do so much more, and now we only have 5.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's all because of AI
Yeah.
and automation and things like that. And so that's cool for me.
Yeah.
As CEO of Silicon Slopes,
Yeah.
right? But, we lost, I don't know, 75% of again, there's only 20, now there's 5.
Yeah.
And so if I'm, a college student or a normal Utahn and I hear things like that, I'm like, whoa, that is crazy.
Yeah.
So how is the state thinking? And I want you to talk about the job loss too, because I think the job loss piece is maybe the biggest fear. It's not the only fear, but I think it's probably the biggest fear that just the average American and the average Utahn would have around AI. And it's real. We can't say that it's not real. Like it will for sure create a job loss. Now, historically, technology has also created jobs to make up for the jobs that have lost. And so that could certainly be the case here as well. But in the near term, there will be job disruptions. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, it is something that the state is thinking really deeply about, and I think that's where Governor Cox has a lot of anxiety as well, both on that and the exploitation potential, harming kids stuff. I think I feel like labor economists are all over the map on this in terms of, as you said, Clint, historically, technology has brought more jobs than it's destroyed. People are sort of, we don't know with AI, maybe not. And I don't know, and I won't opine on that because I just think none of us really knows what's going to happen with that. I do think, though, that this will be a really important catalyst to really disrupt how we educate, particularly in higher ed, but even in K-12. I think that higher ed in this country has needed a giant kick in the pants for a long time, to be quite frank. And the pace of technological change has sort of started to tweak some of it. But I think with AI coming so fast and furious, it's going to really, really push them towards new models, and I hope it does. It was fascinating. I was out in Boston with my 16-year-old on a college tour, some of the most elite universities that we visited in the country, and none of them mentioned this at all. Like, just not even thinking about it. They're just selling their nice country club campuses. I mean, it kind of made me laugh.
Yeah.
But I think Utah really, our system of higher ed, USHE, and our K-12 schools, the leaders there are thinking deeply. We've been convening conversations around this, and I do think we have to do things radically different. One of the things I've heard a lot is that durable skills, so sometimes we call them soft skills, but durable skills will become increasingly important, and that's what you really want to learn as you're a student. And then all the stuff on top of that, the hard skills, that's the stuff that's going to become a little more ephemeral, because it's going to the need for that is going to change quickly. So I think that there will be a much bigger role, frankly, for companies to be involved in the training and education of our workforce, because it's going to happen quickly. And I think probably historically, before you had a lot of higher ed, companies were doing more of that. Now they've sort of ceded that to higher ed over the last 50 years. I think we're going to have to go back to where companies are doing more of that and offering apprenticeships. If they want to have workers in the future, they've got to get people trained now, even if they feel like some of those functions, those lower level functions, could be done by AI. And so I think that'll be an interesting model for us to explore, is like, if you think about, what makes a worker valuable and how that value accrues, well, the value accrues to the worker himself or herself, right? They get to be paid for the skills they have. The value accrues to the company that's utilizing them, and the value is accrued to society in general. So we pay tax dollar dollars to subsidize higher ed and all this kind of stuff. The question is, the companies haven't historically done a lot of that formal training, and so the question is, how much will they do in the future?
Yeah.
Can I just disrupt, because keep on the thought
Yeah.
of like job loss real quick, Gavin, but as you were talking about tax dollars to higher ed institutions and things like that, I had to ask, and again, this is a total tangent, how can the University of Utah sell their athletics program?
Yeah, I saw that news. I didn't know.
You guys hear this? There's like a private equity firm that's
Yes,
come in,
I
was like, whoa.
and now there's a for-profit entity,
It's
$500
just now
million for the.
it's a full business now. Like, that's just
And
what
so,
it is.
how is that not like saying that higher education is not already disrupted? How is that not saying that higher education is only about the sports teams
Yeah.
and kind of nothing else?
I mean, I think you're kind of onto something,
Yeah.
right? I mean, my daughter literally just got a flyer from the University of Chicago, trying to recruit her to apply or whatever, and all it was touting was the different coffee shops it had. And I just thought, well, that is fascinating. So that's going to be the value proposition of these higher institutions. It's experiential.
I mean, it's probably, so my comment, this on the theme of what I was going to say, which is like, there's times of a significant technological and societal disruption. In those moments, who thrives, And there's winners and losers in those moments, of course. And who thrives are people who are entrepreneurial. And, who they see the disruption as an opportunity. They're self-learners. They see what's valuable. They get those skills. They get those resources, and they go after. They put things together. They put, one of the things that in classical economics we talk about, an entrepreneur puts together the factors of production and organizes them in a way that's pointed at something that's valuable. And I think that's increasingly true of all workers in the future, right? This is an incredible. So there's no doubt there'll be the consumer surplus to society will be significant. Now that's not enough to be good, as we know, right? It doesn't always trickle down. It doesn't always, those are still really problematic. And so it's on all of us to train, to educate, and to create opportunities, and to create safety nets for people who fall through. But clearly, this moment is such that, so many more startups, so many entrepreneurs are possible because instead of 20 employees, it takes 5. And, we are seeing startups get to a similar level of revenue with like half or a third or 20% of the employees. Awesome for efficiency, not as good for job growth, but more startups are possible. Does that make sense? So there is clearly gains to society, but they're not evenly distributed for sure. And so I do think that's, students and even existing professionals. I mean, this is the first time I've seen experienced computer science, folks, developers, struggling to find work. Like in some ways, these people have felt like they had full employment rights for life. They were always chased, they were always being headhunted, and now it's like, shoot, I can't find a position. So it's an interesting time that way. But for me, it's a time of disruption, a great opportunity for Utah, right? Because our state, it's always been like we know what it's like to be underdogs. We know what it's like to be overlooked, and it's like, okay, new rules. Anyway, there's lots of metaphors we could use for that, but that's kind of how I feel about it. But it's there's gonna be a lot of change, and you have the ability to make things happen much more quickly, but you got to have a plan, And I agree. I think increasingly, that some of those higher level skills, there's some social skills there's some strategic thinking, are going to dominate maybe some of the more technical skills that dominated for a while.
Let's take 2 or 3 questions. I want to be respectful of their time and all of yours. Raise your hand.
So yeah, the question I have is, I used to work in government, and there's a pattern that plays out over and over again with new legislation. And that's that it starts out reasonable, and then over time, it's actually the big tech companies and the big players in the field who actually demand more regulation.
Yeah.
And on the surface, it looks like it's altruistic. Really, it's trying to protect their spot and kind of kicking the ladder out of the new guys coming up. And for you, there's a lot of pressure to go along with it because, well, they're asking for it. It's unresponsible to, not do what they're asking. And so I guess my question is there a way to insulate from that? Because it's happened literally in almost every industry.
You're talking about regulatory capture. I think that ends up happening a lot at the federal level, and I think we actually do have a risk of that happening at the federal level if and when anything gets passed by those 5 companies we've sort of referred to lobbying for that. I see it at the state level, not in this space at all, because we're not trying to cater to those companies at all. They're not located here, those big ones. But where I see that happening a ton is on workforce regulation, occupational licensing. So our department licenses about 500,000 people in the state of Utah just to do their jobs. I've been aggressively during my 5 years trying to do deregulation, smart deregulation, because that's where you get massive regulatory capture. So I think it's really just, how do you avoid that? I mean, it's tough because just like anything, there is money involved in politics and there is lobbying involved, and that matters to people that are elected officials. And so it's not just regulatory capture that can accrue value to companies. It's all sorts of breaks, whether it's tax breaks or grants that are given. All of those things are done often through political influence. And so as government officials, we just have to be on guard for that. And believe me, someday I'm going to write a book about all the work I've done to try to, and the work that we've done to try to work against some of the regulatory capture that we have in the form of occupational licensing in Utah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Maybe I would just add, just the national level, where I'm involved with specific things for our industry. Yeah, there's a lot of momentum going in certain directions, and I think it's really good to understand that and say, hey, just because when you have large companies saying, hey, please give me more regulation because I care about you, just be a little bit skeptical, of maybe, of kind of their ultimate intent, because that is a classic way that you keep out competitors. And if you think about some of the large tech companies, who are they really afraid of? Well, they're afraid of them, themselves, 10, 15 years ago. That's who they're afraid of. They're not afraid of other large companies. They're afraid of, the poor, immigrants or the poor college student is going to start the thing and bet everything they have to beat them. That's who they're afraid of. And so they're actively trying to put up roadblocks to prevent that. And so that's what I'm doing, is trying to clear the way for those folks to have a shot. It's so hard to be successful, but if we get enough shots on goal, we will have the choices that keep, because that's really the only way to keep, these industries honest, is that they have competitors. It was kind of interesting. I mean, interesting how the narrative shifted on AI, where it was like, oh, we need to regulate these companies. Let's pause, Elon, and it's like, and then China launches a model that competes. Hold on, whoa, and then also you realize OpenAI looked like they're running away with it. Google just launched their latest rev. oh, it's better. It's better in every way. It's faster, it's easier, it's better, it's less, woke, or it's less whatever. And it's like, okay. And so competition is kind of is like the consumer's friend, and like making sure we keep it fluid and is so key.
Well, and just that's also what our Office of AI Policy is trying to do, is give Utah companies, AI companies, the ability to come and say, this is a bad regulation.
Yeah.
Let's relieve it. So if any of you have those
Yeah.
companies you're interested in, talk to Courtney back there. She's back there.
Which and that's unique, right? Like our state, our elected members, the staff, our national members. I mean, again, this is partly why we matter, is that they listen to us. They actually care what the business sector and other sectors say, and we're kind of common sense, which is great.
Started working with models maybe like 6 or 7 years ago. Image generation hit before we got to text generation. And in playing with those, I was like, okay, well, this will do about 80%. So anything where 80%, and it's all synthetic data. Everything that a model generates is fake. Some of that fakeness happens to line up with reality in certain ways that are kind of useful sometimes. But one of the big things so my background's in data engineering, and as a data architect, all of the compute required to make these models to me, that's a huge optimization problem. And I see that trend going this way, right? There's a big push to build all these data centers, and that's contrary to the trend that technology has taken, over the past 100 years, longer even, really. And so I wonder if there's something to be said about aligning all of our incentives so that, and I kind of give it up to China for this, because they're going around, they're saying, okay, we can now import H200s. Do we want to?
Yeah.
Because I think their limitations have caused them to go, pursue more algorithmic optimization and things like that. So, and that's kind of my startup. I'm going after uses for machine learning that look like kind of what these big companies do, but they're extremely efficient. They run much faster. Humans can read and edit the models. I mean, there are a bunch of benefits. So I wonder if there are ways that we can align the incentives so that we have all of those benefits. We can read models, we can understand them, they run faster. We don't need to build, we don't need to waste all these resources on building data centers, and we align ourselves better with how things have developed over time.
I've got a simple answer to a complex question there, which is that markets work and the incentives are there, which is like, right now, there is demand, way more demand for power than there's supply available. And so like anywhere can be power built, which is really hard, again, regulatory capture, is being done. And so, the price, so what happens? The price rises dramatically. Now that can hurt consumers, which I think we need to do some things there to kind of, have it be different prices for data centers versus, folks, trying to pay their power bill. But I think that's going to drive the optimization, right? It's like, so we can't outpower China. No way. It's not, like, I hope we can do better than we are, because we need that for other reasons other than just AI. But I would just say, like, markets work and the incentives are, like, the incentives are building to do it exactly. And I actually think that's ultimately what happens here, is that we start to get, we've already had, I don't know what we'll say, but an order of magnitude achievement in power efficiency for a given, query or training, and I think we'll keep having those. We kind of need to have those. So that's what I would guess is going to happen here, but I think the incentives are going to build for that.
And just one more comment. I don't think everything has to be a war.
Totally.
I don't think we have to be at war with anybody over this.
Totally.
I feel like that sometimes gets way too political and tends to drive negative cycles.
Right. And I definitely wouldn't characterize this as a war, but I think we have to be careful to not be naive that there are winners and losers. And the world order we have, again, I'm a big believer in the U.S. I think we all are here. The U.S. has its problems. We've made a bunch of mistakes. But I think we've been the most moral superpower in the history of the earth, Not even close, you know? And so it's a different world, I think. It's, you know, maybe it's better in some ways and worse in others if China is calling the shots, but it's really different, is what I would say.
Let's take one more from over here.
Thank you. So I had a simple and a quick question, is that along the lines of the topic of the day, you know, right now it does seem like war, like was just mentioned. And so, and then we have these two powerful entities, the federal agencies or the federal side and the gov side, which is us essentially. So I wanted to, you know, bring this up as a question in terms of what the next steps could be in terms of how do we avoid confrontation, and is there a middle ground that the state is thinking about, where as against being you know, confrontational, you against us kind of a thing. And I loved the fact that you mentioned that from our perspective, letting the feds develop AI, and the implementation and the enforcement part could be taken over the state. But along those lines, are there any middle ground thoughts that we have that we could propose to the federal government?
Well, we are proposing different things to the federal government as we speak. I think really a great approach would be to actually gather in all the states, particularly the states that are innovating around policy, like Utah, that are doing good things, taking balanced approaches, and you know, have working groups, convene working groups, like what is the right approach and how do we do this, and really do a consensus-driven process so that states are feeling comfortable with the purview that they have, and that they also feel comfortable with the federal government. And that also gives, when states are behind what the federal government is doing, that'll give their federal delegations much more freedom to then go and actually get something done in Congress. So I think there's an approach that can be taken that states help to sort of come together around this. The good thing about tech policy right now in this moment is it's not terribly politically polarized from between Democrats and Republicans, which means there's an opportunity to get something meaningful done. There's lots of different agreements on the approach, but it's not like immigration where it's essentially to the advantage of both Republicans and Democrats not do anything so they can keep using it as a political punching bag. That's not where we are with tech policy. So I think there's a real opportunity right now to convene states together, to come up with solutions, and to give Congress the sort of the prerogative and the motivation to get it done, and give them the political cover to get it done as well.
Thank you. So I would love for us and you to actually take the lead on that. And the parallels we can draw is the litigation that you have started with companies like TikTok. So I consider you as a protector of my teenager daughter against TikTok. So we can extend that same concept, build a consortium of the states, and maybe start a confrontation with the big five or the big six out there. Thank you.
Don't announce any lawsuits here, Margaret.
Well, we've already announced that we are suing TikTok, we are suing Snap, and we are suing Meta. So.
Okay.
That's cool. None of those are
Game
Utah
on.
companies. Hey, give it up to Gavin and Margaret. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.